Good to see everyone this morning. If you will, turn to number 304, The Precious Book Divine. (304). How precious is the book divine, by inspiration given. Bright as a lamp its precepts shine, to guide my soul to heaven. Holy book divine, precious treasure mine, lamp to my feet and a light to my way, to guide me safely home. It sweetly cheers my drooping heart in this dark vale of tears. Light to my life it still imparts, and quells my rising fears. Holy book divine, precious treasure mine, lamp to my feet and a light to my way, to guide me safely home. This lamp through all the tedious night life shall guide my way, till I behold the clearer light of an eternal day. Holy book divine, precious treasure mine, lamp to my feet and a light to my way, to guide me safely home. Dennis, would you start us with a word of prayer, please?
Holy Father, we bow before you. Thank you for being a loving God and providing this new day for us. We're thankful it's the first day of the week. We pray, Father, for those in other parts of the world who this morning, this day, have to hide in secret in order to worship you without suffering from enemies of you and the church. We pray, Father, for their well-being. We thank you for the freedoms we enjoy in this land where we can gather together as we are now to study your word. We pray that you bless our class time this morning. Pray that you would be with Mike as he directs our class, be with us as students and listeners. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Matthew chapter 9. Jesus had completed his 3 illustrations concerning the old law and the new. But it was the third illustration that really brought home the fact that the new law would replace the old, not be woven into it. Luke adds an important detail to what Jesus said about the new wine versus the old. In Luke chapter 5, verse 39, Jesus said, "No man also having drunk all old wine immediately desires the new, for he says the old is better." So Jesus understood the difficulty that there would be with the Jews readily accepting a change in laws. He says, like the old law or old wine versus the new, men are going to prefer the old because it has a richer flavor to it. Not only from maturing over time, but also being mixed in the old wineskins which had absorbed the juices of several vintages. One scholar wrote, "The comparative merits of the old and new wine are not touched by the parable, but the taste for them. One who is accustomed to old will not wish for new, does not attract him by look or fragrance. The prejudiced person will not even try the new or admit that it has any merit. He knows that the old is pleasant and it suits him, and that's enough. He's not going to change." So it was with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes that they were not about to accept the new. The old was just fine for their taste. And that's the point that Jesus is trying to make here with the old wine and the new wine. And as we witness in the gospel accounts, even during the writing of the epistles, the Jews fought hard against the change. Even the Judaizers continued to follow the apostles, particularly Paul. And as soon as he had taught some Gentiles and moved on, they were right in behind him to fight for adding the old wine to the new, the old law to the new, making them both work together. Which unfortunately the Galatians had done that very thing, hadn't they? And the church of Antioch was about to do when Paul and Barnabas returned and eventually went to Jerusalem to argue against it. Verse 18, we find Matthew continuing to tell us about Jesus' ministry here in Galilee. While he spoke these things, talking about the old wine, the new wine, and that, behold, a ruler came and worshipped him, saying, My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. So Jesus arose and followed him, and so did his disciples. Suddenly, a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years came from behind and touched the hem of his garment. For she said to herself, If only I may touch his garment, I shall be made well. But Jesus turned around, and when he saw her, he said, Be of good cheer, daughter, your faith has made you well. And the woman was made well from that hour. When Jesus came into the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the noisy crowd wailing, he said to them, Make room, for the girl is not dead but sleeping. And they ridiculed him. But when the crowd was put outside, he went in, took her by the hand. The girl arose, and the report of this went out into all the land. Here in verse 18, Matthew does something that the other writers did not. He uses the genitive absolute concerning the request of Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue. How do we know his name, since Matthew doesn't mention it?
Mark or Luke, actually Mark and Luke, I think, both recorded.
Yeah, both of them do, don't they? Yeah. Mark chapter 5, verse 22, Luke chapter 8 and verse 41 gives his name. So Matthew's use of the genitive absolute shows us a strict connection of time. In other words, it connects what Jesus has just taught about the old wine and the new wine immediately to Jairus' interruption and asking him to heal his daughter. So the two are, Matthew is showing us that these two are together. They're at the same time happening. But we don't see that in Mark and Luke, do we? We see them tying this into the seashore in the Sea of Galilee when he came back across, got out of the boat, and the crowd was waiting for him. And they tie it into Jairus being part of that crowd, waiting for him, instead of this particular time. Now, some commentators argue that because Matthew's writing style, where he usually does not use chronological arrangements, that this account should be viewed in the same way, that it's not chronological. But the genitive absolute sets it in this particular arrangement. Just because we want to look at what the others did doesn't necessarily mean that we have to here in Matthew's account. While he yet spake these things to them, verse 18. I mean, doesn't that show us these things? What's he speaking to them? Didn't say while he got out of the boat. It says while he was speaking these things. It also shows us the urgency of Jairus' request. Apparently, Jesus is willing to interrupt the discussion as well in order to follow this man to his home and to heal his daughter. What better way to demonstrate God's mercy than to assist this grief-stricken individual? Now, Jesus didn't just teach about God's mercy. He showed it as well, as the case is here, and as has been the case in other healings. Now, Matthew tells us that a ruler came to him concerning his daughter. Mark 5:22 says, one of the rulers of the synagogue. And Luke 8:41 says, a man named Jairus. He was a ruler of the synagogue. So he spells it out just a little bit more. Now, keeping in mind who Matthew is writing to, who Luke and Mark are writing to, as to why they write the way they're writing. Matthew's writing to who? To the Jews. So they would have understood the place of the ruler and didn't need to have the added details. Whereas Mark and Luke are writing to Gentiles. So Matthew continues by saying, Jairus fell at his feet and worshiped while making this request. Now, it's not so much worship as we think of worship, but instead he's paying respect to Jesus. He's demonstrating humility in making this request. Jairus tells Jesus, my daughter is even now dead. Now, Matthew's account, once again, doesn't get into the details, but just simply lays out the end result. Mark and Luke both inform us that Jairus told Jesus about his daughter. She's sick and in the process of dying. Where Matthew says, she's dead. She's already dead.
Either Mark or Luke, I think, was telling, said somebody said, why bother to teach her anymore? Your little girl is dead. Like somebody was sent there after he had already, at the time, she must have still been alive when he was pleading with Jesus.
Right.
But then one of them, Luke or Mark, they made a comment that, why bother him anymore? Your girl is dead.
Well, both Mark and Luke say that, yeah. Yeah, some came from Jairus' house to let him know. You know, they understood that he went to see Jesus to bring him back to get her healed before she died. And now they're saying, so they rushed to him saying, well, sorry, she already is dead. Don't bother him anymore. You know, no sense in bothering him. And we'll get into that a little bit later, a little bit deeper into that. But they're told in Mark chapter 5, verse 35, and Luke 8 and verse 49, that some are sent to him to let him know that she's already passed. So Matthew is only summing up the matter here. So Jairus then asked Jesus to come to his home, lay hands upon his daughter so she will live. Now that's not what Mark said, or Matthew says, but Mark and Luke both give us that detail. Now he doesn't have the great faith the centurion had, who believed that Jesus could heal with just a word. He didn't even need to come to the home. All he had to say is, she's healed, that's it. But he still had faith that Jesus could restore her life by laying hands on his daughter. Maybe he had witnessed this happen before. Possibly he just heard about it from others, that Jesus had done something like this. Whatever the case, we see Jesus getting up and following him. Verse 19, following the lead of Jairus, Jesus and his disciples head to the ruler's house. But it's not only the 12 disciples that accompany him, but the multitude as well, who he had been teaching. The curiosity and excitement of the crowd caused them to, they weren't even considering what was going on, what they were doing, making it almost impossible for Jesus to make his way to Jairus' house. It was almost a mob scene. Everyone bunched in shoulder to shoulder as they moved through the streets. In fact, Mark and Luke say they were crowding the narrow streets, not realizing that they were impeding Jesus' progress. Now, of course, it was not as if the young girl was sick and about to die. She had already passed from this life. So there's not really that much of a hurry needed. I mean, Jesus waited 4 days before going to raise Lazarus, right? Verse 20 and 20 to 22, we have this woman that was sick for 12 years. While Jesus and the crowd are going through the narrow streets and to Jairus' house, we're told that this woman is in this crowd. And she's stealthily making her way to Jesus. Why? Why would she do that? Yeah. Her faith and ability for Jesus to heal. Yeah. So verse 20 and 21, Matthew says, suddenly a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years came from behind and touched the hem of his garment. For she said to herself, if only I may touch his garment, I shall be made well. Mark records, and Jesus went with him, and much people followed him and thronged him. And a certain woman, which had an issue of blood 12 years, had suffered many things of many physicians, had spent all that she had, and was nothing bettered, but rather grew worse. When she heard of Jesus, came in the press behind and touched his garment, for she said, if I may touch his clothes, I shall be whole. Mark 5, verse 24 to 28. And Luke basically says the same thing. So this woman was not following Jesus like the crowd was following him to see what's going to happen with Jairus' daughter. She's concerned about herself. She's heard about his healing ability. And she's convinced if she can only just touch his garment, that she'll be healed. So we see her determination here as she comes up from behind Jesus and his disciples, clawing her way through the dense crowd, focused on where he is, so she can just touch his clothes. Her determination caused her to set aside the fact that according to the law, she was unclean. And being unclean, everyone that she touched became unclean. Leviticus 15, verse 19 to 31. Numbers 19:22. So who knows how many Jews she caused to become unclean because of her ambition to be healed. That's why she's kind of being stealthy. I mean, she had lost all she had, paying doctor after doctor and getting no relief. Because of her uncleanness, she's unable to marry. She can't have any human contact whatsoever. You know, as they say, desperate times call for desperate measures, right? She was desperate because she was getting worse, not better. Because of her uncleanness, she could not go to Jesus publicly to be cleansed. This was her only chance she had. She thought if she could just sneak through that crowd, maybe unnoticed by anyone due to their excitement, that she could get down and just touch the hem of his garment, and no one would be the wiser. Now, some are going to question, okay, why does she need to touch the hem of his garment? Why does she need to get down there in the dust of the street to do that? Well, it's because in this time there was a special meaning to the hem of one's outer coat. The law required that the four corners of the outer coat have a blue tassel sewn to it. And this was a reminder of their holiness to God, that the person was committed to doing God's will. Deuteronomy 22:12. Numbers 15, verse 37 to 41. So this woman is focused on the tassels. She needs to touch those tassels, thinking that that's where his healing powers are coming from, because he's showing that he's a holy person. He's doing God's will. So as she touches these tassels and is healed, Mark and Luke record Jesus says, "Who touched me?" I mean, all she did is just touch the garment. She didn't touch him. Luke recorded that everyone denied touching him. It wasn't me, I didn't do it. And then Peter says, "How could you ask such a question? Here we are all huddled together in this crowd and you're asking who touched me?" Luke 8:45.
I had a question that, well, it's not really a question that, as to how Jesus knew somebody touched him. Well, Luke and Mark tell us that he felt the power go out of him. And I never knew what that meant then, other than being who he was. He just
Mm-hmm.
knew. But I think Mark and Luke both say he felt the power
Yeah,
go out of him, or something along those lines.
right.
I read that last night.
Yeah.
And I was
Mm-hmm.
wondering what he meant by felt the fire go out of me, other than making some assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, Luke 8:46. Well, someone touched me because I felt the power go out of me. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Luke says the woman presented herself. When Jesus said this, she presented herself to Jesus and confessed what she had done and why she did it. And it's here that Matthew, Mark, and Luke record what Jesus says to her. "Be of good cheer, your faith has made you whole." Now, Jesus didn't do this to embarrass the woman, but to show the crowd how necessary faith is. And we also notice The faith of this woman, Jesus says, has made her whole. He's not teaching faith alone, is he? He's talking about faith plus action, faith plus works. So hers was essentially an active faith, not a dead one. So no doubt that many in the crowd had touched Jesus' garment. Yet none of them were cured of any ailments they might have had, were they? The difference was her faith plus her determination to express her faith. That is what healed her. Matthew makes it appear as if her healing occurred after Jesus spoke to her. Within the hour. It doesn't mean that it was 60 minutes or less that it took for her to be healed. The Greek word means instantly. As soon as she touched his tassels, she was instantly healed. Verse 23 and 24, reaching the home of Jairus. Jesus enters the house, but not alone. Mark informs us that Jesus allowed Peter, James, and John to accompany him into the house. Mark 5, verse 37, Luke 8 and verse 51. And perhaps Jesus' plan was to leave the 9 outside, kind of as crowd control. Because he didn't need everyone in the house as they had filled the house before when the men had to let their friend down through the roof. Didn't need that. Didn't want that. So his focus is upon Jairus, his wife and his daughter. And they don't need the distraction that a big crowd in the house is going to bring. Upon entering, what does Jesus see? People wailing and flute players, right? Yeah. Making a tumult, as Matthew describes it. The New King James says, the noisy crowd wailing. Okay. Which agrees with Mark and Luke, who say weeping and loud wailing is going on. Now, we would see such thing possibly as strange or maybe offensive. But this was a common gathering in the first century when it came to a funeral or someone who has died. Ours are more solemn gatherings, but theirs were openly emotional gatherings. Louder. They viewed the louder the mourning, the longer it lasted, demonstrated a deeper sense of grief and loss. I don't know, it's kind of a little bit different over in the Middle East, we think belching is rude. But if you don't belch over there after you've eaten a meal, they feel like you didn't appreciate the meal that they served you. So things are a little bit different over there than they are here. And families might even hire professional mourners to come in. So we see in Second Chronicles 35 and verse 25. Jeremiah 9, verse 17 to 22. So as Jesus proceeds through the house, he commands the people, give place. Or as we would say, make room. Make room, I'm coming. Get out of my way. He informs the people in Mark 5:39, Luke 8:52, to stop weeping. This child is not dead, she's only sleeping. Now, depending upon the English translation, we find maid, we find damsel, child, little girl, or just girl. All the same Greek word, but it refers to this particular Greek word means a young child. Yeah, she was 12 years old, but she was considered a young child. She wasn't considered to be a mature adult woman. Jesus was trying to correct the view of the people that when one died, that doesn't mean that they've ceased living. Doesn't mean both body and spirit is dead. But apparently these people held the view of the Pharisees, which caused their reaction to Jesus' words. All three accounts say the people laughed him to scorn. Their belief was that surely this girl was dead, and there's nothing anyone can do to bring her back. Now, some commentators will argue that, yes, they agree with the people. She wasn't really dead. She was in a deep coma. But we know that that's not what Jesus meant when he told the people she was only sleeping. Sleeping throughout the scriptures always has been a synonym for death, not coma. I mean, we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 where Paul argues for the resurrection. There are some in Corinth who didn't believe in the resurrection. They believed like these people, that once you died, you're like Rover, you're dead all over, right? So Jesus is trying to present to them a new thought that they had never thought of before. And it's by the very attitude of these people insisting the girl's dead and there's nothing you can do to change it, that they made an affirmation before everyone present. They were all agreeing to the state of this girl, that she was dead. No one could change that. And Jesus allowed that because he knew when he raised her, the fact of the miracle bringing her back to life, something the people thought was impossible, would change their mind, change their way of thinking. These people failed. They even refused to believe in the resurrection from the dead. Even though they might have hoped it to be true, they instead accepted the error of the Sadducees. So it was they, the crowd, that were on trial, not Jesus. Yeah, they laughed him to scorn. They were putting him on trial, but it was in reverse. He had presented them a truth, and they refused to accept it. Now, surely the parents of this little girl were not willing to accept the conclusion of the crowd, even though maybe in their hearts they had accepted that as true. But they're at the point now where they're grasping at every straw to restore her life. And if it's true of Jairus and his wife, that they believe that once you're dead, that's it, why did Jairus go and beg Jesus to heal his daughter in the first place? He might have been at that point in between. He'd always thought that once you died, and that was it. But he's possibly witnessed Jesus' healings. He's most likely heard about it. And so he's he's kind of torn between the two views. Which is it? And now that he's torn between these two views, he's hoping that Jesus can. He's hoping he's wrong, that once you're dead, you're dead. At this point, verse 25 to 26, with the doubt of the people, Jesus puts them out of the room. Get out. And he gets to work. Not only he himself, but the parents and his 3 disciples are in the room. They need a state of quietness, not the tumult and confusion of the crowd, as well as their scorning Jesus. He might have thrown them out knowing in their hearts that they might try to stop him from raising her from the dead. They were so convinced that that couldn't be done. Only Jesus, Peter, James, John, Jairus, his wife, and their daughter are left in the room. As his would-be apostles, they needed to witness what was about to happen for themselves so that they could be qualified to be apostles. Jesus has always been involved in things that could cause him to be considered unclean. Touching the leper to cleanse him. Allowing the woman with the disease 12 years to touch him. And now, to touch a dead body? All those things would cause an individual to be considered unclean according to the law. Jesus, however, is the exception to the rule. Unlike the average human being, the average Jew who had no supernatural powers. When they touched someone or someone touched them, both were now unclean. Because the one who became unclean had no power to cleanse the unclean person like Jesus did. Jesus always left 2 clean individuals, whole, undefiled, and alive. Taking the girl by the hand, immediately, instantly, she arose from the dead. There weren't all these constant chantings and all that to get her to come like you see people today. Same as they do with any so-called miracle they claim to do. Luke says her spirit returned. Luke 8:55. Which is exactly what James points out, right? The body without the spirit is dead. James 2:26. So the spirit returns so the body can live again. So as soon as she arose, she bounced out of bed into her parents' arms. And what's the first thing Jesus does? So we only learn in Mark and Luke. He tells his parents, feed her. Get her something to eat. Why? Why would he tell her that? Tell them that. Hopefully to prove to her amazed parents, this isn't a ghost. This is a real human being that can eat. Commanding the parents not to tell anyone what happened. But like the demon-possessed man that was told the same thing and the leper, they went out and told anyway. And even if the parents hadn't said anything, the crowd's going to, aren't they? Once they notice and find out that she's alive, they're going to publish it everywhere, causing Jesus' fame to continue to grow. Any questions? Thoughts? Yeah, Dennis.
Question regarding this power going out of Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
the Lord Jesus. In Luke chapter 8, verse 47, Jesus speaking, saying, "Someone did touch me, and I perceived the power going out from me." But his question before that must have been, "Who touched me?" That what we read earlier.
Yeah, Matthew said, yeah.
How, is that telling us that Jesus didn't know who did it, or is that telling us that knowing who did it, he wanted to bring attention to her who did it?
He wanted
Teaching.
he wanted the crowd
Otherwise,
to,
he couldn't.
yeah. I mean, everybody's, they're all milling down the street together, all shoulder to shoulder. And by him saying that stops everybody in their tracks. What's he talking about here? But he says that after, he said at first, "Who touched me?" Then Peter said, "What are you talking about? We're all crowded in here. Why would you say that?" And then he said about touching, and then because I felt the power go out. Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot of what Jesus said or did was for the benefit of the multitudes, to get the people to stop and think.
This is probably in next week's thing when he heals, does some more healing. There was words like, he told Jairus' mother and father not to tell anyone.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we said.
Yeah.
And I think there was words used, well, I'll just wait till next week, because it was words like sternly warned them not to tell anybody that they
Yeah.
go out.
And
First thing they did was
yeah.
told.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah.
know.
Well, the same thing was said about the leper and the demon-possessed guy. He sternly forbid them to tell anybody. That's the first thing they did, is went out and published it. Mm-hmm.
I don't know, probably might have already known that was going to happen, but.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And why he did that, I don't know, because he knew that the multitudes were going to do it anyway. Even if the individual he told not to, everybody else would do it. So it's going to be published.
Is that a warning to us? That we overensure we are indeed interfered with or
Yeah, I mean, it could. Kind of as an example, a principle. Yeah. All righty.